Kyiv and Washington have reportedly agreed to the terms of a draft minerals and resources deal. The agreement could be signed as early as Friday, with plans for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to travel to the United States to meet with Donald Trump. The U.S. president has been demanding Ukraine give access to its rare earth minerals in what Trump calls payback for wartime aid provided by the U.S. under Joe Biden.
For that, I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly, it's okay with me if he'd like to, and he would like to sign it together with me, and I understand that's a big deal, very big deal. And I think the American people, even if you look at polling, they're very happy because, you know, Biden was throwing money around like it's cotton candy, and it's a very big deal. It could be $1 trillion deal. It could be whatever.
So before the pens are drawn and the deal is done, let's take a look at exactly what we know about these mineral resources that suddenly seem so central to the future of Ukraine.
Fighting near a Ukrainian village on the front lines last year. Tank battles raged above ground that geologists estimate holds hundreds of millions of dollars of lithium. That's just one of the resources that Ukraine has significant deposits of. There are also deposits of graphite, titanium, zirconium, and rare earth metals spread across Ukraine. Some in the areas controlled by Russia, but much in the territory Ukraine itself still controls. Potentially worth more than $10 trillion, making Ukraine potentially a very rich country. The White House sent the Treasury Secretary to Ukraine to sign a deal. An alleged leaked draft said the U.S. would get half the money Ukraine earns from mining, as well as oil and gas resources, ports, and other infrastructure. The Trump deal has been compared to the Treaty of Versailles imposed on Germany after it lost World War I, which forced Germany to pay what would now be hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations. The amount Ukraine would end up paying is far greater in adjusted terms, despite the fact that Russia is the aggressor in the current war. The Trump team sees minerals as compensation for past and possible future aid. Ukraine sees its mineral wealth as its path forward to rebuilding after the war eventually ends. Ukraine can't afford to alienate the U.S. and lose its backing, but fears that without security guarantees against further Russian aggression, it might get nothing in return for signing away its wealth.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly from Kyiv. Nick, what more do we know about what the parties have reportedly agreed to at this point?
Nicole, it is very difficult. There are lots of competing reports, most of them based on briefings, unnamed officials, very few kind of officials coming out with their names and talking about detail. So I think we have to kind of foreground those doubts. But seemingly it has been possible for the Ukrainians to firstly get rid of that $500 billion figure that was kind of floating around. That was what Trump and his team were saying that Ukraine owed the United States. Obviously, Ukraine has always stressed that it received only about ballpark $100 billion in US aid since the beginning of this war, so that was obviously a huge difference there. It also seems that they've basically kicked the kind of details of how America is going to get money from this down the line and say that's going to be kind of something to be agreed in future through future agreements. And basically, all we've kind of heard so far is that 50% of the revenues from new projects in oil, gas, rare earth metals, critical minerals will be put into a fund. And what the Americans get out of those 50%, we don't know yet. I think at this point, it's a face-saving, obviously, effort. The Ukrainians don't want to risk another kind of falling out with the Americans like we had last week when Donald Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator. But equally, you know, they are very clear. We had Zelenskyy saying recently he doesn't want to sign a deal that will take 10 generations for Ukraine to pay back.
Is there a sense that Ukraine got what it wanted?
I think it's a bit early to say that. I think until this is signed, until we see the text, I would be a little careful about saying that. There's been so much turbulence about this. We've heard so many extraordinary stories of Zelenskyy supposedly shouting at the US Treasury Secretary who arrived in Kiev 2 weeks ago, expecting him to sign on the dotted line immediately without any option for Ukraine to negotiate. But certainly we have seen that Ukraine has stood its ground and has called out Donald Trump, said, you know, Zelenskyy saying that Trump is surrounded by Russian disinformation hasn't basically withered under the pressure. So there is a sense that while Ukraine wants to obviously maintain its links to Washington, it is not rolling over immediately every time there's a kind of tweet or a Truth Social post from the White House.
Zelensky and Trump have traded sharp rhetoric in the past. You mentioned it before. Trump called Zelensky a dictator. Do you expect that to change after their reported meeting on Friday?
So that obviously has been a kind of big topic here in Ukraine, the idea that Zelensky has to meet Trump before Putin does, and that hopefully that personal connection and that personal meeting will allow him to get past some of the kind of negativity of recent weeks. We simply don't know. Obviously, this agreement doesn't include clear security guarantees that the Ukrainians wanted. We've heard the Ukrainians saying that the Americans are saying this is all part of a bigger picture, and also the Americans seem convinced that if there is big American investment in Ukrainian resources, that suddenly, somehow, the Russians will not invade. Again, the Ukrainians aren't convinced by that. They say there was big American investment in Ukraine, maybe not on this current scale, but before 2014. That didn't stop the Russians coming then. So I think this is all part of a bigger negotiation. And I think there's a sense here that, just sign something that doesn't have too many commitments and hope that changes the tone.
That's DW correspondent Nick Connolly reporting from Kyiv. Thank you so much. For more, I'm joined now by foreign policy expert Tyson Barker, who worked on Ukraine under the Biden administration. Welcome back to DW, Tyson. Now, President Trump wanted payback. Now it looks like he might get it. Is this more a business venture now for him than an alliance against a violent aggressor?
Well, it's consistent with his approach to foreign policy generally. Even before his first campaign in 2016, he said that what happened in Iraq was the Americans didn't, quote unquote, get the oil, and that they needed to get the oil. So he has been interested in a kind of extractive deal for any American engagement abroad, and this seems to follow that pattern. He's just being able to express it a little less encumbered.
Ukraine has reportedly accepted a deal that, from what we're hearing, does not include security guarantees. Is this just an attempt to keep Trump on their side? What's in it for them?
Well, I've seen a draft version of the deal that came out on the 24th, and it actually has terms that are much more flexible to the benefit of the Ukrainians than some previous iterations of this. It does not include the 500 billion mark that was included in an earlier draft, and it includes the necessity of any joint ventures that the United States and Ukraine set up to also benefit Ukraine's reconstruction. So that's all quite positive. The issue of what its relation is to previous or future assistance is unclear. In fact, it's not mentioned explicitly in the deal. So that still needs to be hammered out, because the previous assistance allocated by the United States Congress was primarily in the form of grants and obligated by the Biden administration. There's no going back to try to collect on that. That is money that has been invested in Ukraine.
Looking at it realistically, though, can Kyiv even afford to say no to anything put on the table right now and potentially risk whatever is left of American support and willingness to provide that support in the future?
Well, U.S. support, particularly in the form of security assistance, has been determinative in Ukraine's ability to survive for these past 3 years, and I think everybody recognizes that. But this is where President Zelensky's particular style of leadership comes into play. I mean, the man has a spine of steel. It's one of the reasons Ukraine was able to survive during those early weeks of the war in 2022. And he was, in fact, willing to walk away, given the onerous terms of previous drafts of this agreement, which is what led the United States to make some concessions in what seems to be emerging as the final draft. So although it is very difficult for Ukraine to do so, it seems that Bankova, Kyiv, would have been willing to walk away if the terms were so onerous to Ukraine.
Trump cozying up with Putin is something that's extremely concerning to all of Ukraine's allies. Ukraine, you said it there, they're willing to walk away, but they do need the U.S. on their side if they do want to persist in the fight against the aggressor. Now, Trump has expressed his respect for Putin in the past, so what we're seeing right now was something to be expected. You worked under the Biden administration. Could the previous administration have worked harder to bring this conflict to an end before Trump came into the White House and maybe secure a more just peace for Ukraine than what it might be forced to accept now?
Well, the previous administration had two primary objectives. One was to support Ukraine, to include Ukraine in any kind of negotiations, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And it devoted, along with the American public, it must be said, around 70% approval for support for Ukraine and 70% of Congress until very recently, when Trump's rhetoric and frankly, disinformation in some cases had a detrimental effect on the perception of this support among the American public and Congress. So it was, first of all, support Ukraine. And second of all, it was to make sure that this war didn't escalate. And we know from information provided that there was the potential for nuclear engagement, nuclear intervention in Ukraine in late 2022, and that is something that the Biden administration was determined to avoid. So in both of those cases, it was able to advance its objectives. The Trump administration has a different objective, which is to end the war as quickly as possible, and in that, the fact that he's so motivated, the administration is so motivated, definitely changes the negotiation dynamic between Russia and Ukraine.
That was foreign policy expert Tyson Barker. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.